Commander Relzek stood on the bridge of the Vorthar, staring out into the black expanse of space. The massive starship, a sleek vessel built for long-distance travel and tactical strikes, was on a routine mission near the edge of the Vorlan Empire's territory. They were charting uninhabited star systems, a standard operation for the Empire's military fleet, when disaster struck. Without warning, the Vorthar's engines sputtered and shut down. The entire ship trembled as sparks flew from the control panels, and the lights flickered. Relzek gritted his teeth, knowing the gravity of the situation. There was nothing they could do to fix the problem. A total engine failure meant they were stranded, helpless. Kotal, the ship's lead engineer, was already at work in the engine room, trying to salvage whatever systems remained functional. His deep growl echoed through the communication system as he relayed his grim report. "Commander, the engine core is completely fried. There's nothing I can do from here. We'll be lucky if we last more than a few hours before we're pulled into the gravitational field of that collapsing star." Relzek cursed under his breath. The situation was far worse than he'd hoped. Their navigation systems were down, and without propulsion, they couldn't escape the pull of the star's expanding gravitational field. The crew was doomed. Virus, the ship's tactical officer, paced back and forth. She was calm, but Relzek could see the tension in her shoulders. Her sharp mind had seen many battles, but this was a different kind of fight. One against time. "We need to send a distress signal," she suggested, her voice steady. "Perhaps someone out there can help." Relzek nodded. It was a last-ditch effort. The Vorlan Empire's territory was sparsely populated, and the nearest fleet was days away. But they had no choice. "Send it out," he ordered, trying to mask the desperation in his tone. The distress beacon launched into the void, a faint pulse of light and sound, disappearing into the blackness. But as they waited in silence, a strange thing happened. Instead of the usual cold, empty response they'd expected, the screen suddenly lit up. A signal came through. An alien signal, faint but clear. "This is Blaise Callahan, pilot of the Stormbreaker, responding to your distress call. I'm on my way. Sit tight." The voice crackled over the communication system, and Relzek froze, eyes narrowing. A human. He'd heard rumors about the Terrans, reckless pilots with a flair for bold stunts and dangerous maneuvers. The Vorlan Empire had never encountered a human directly, but they'd heard stories of their infamous space races and their wild, unpredictable nature. Were they trustworthy? The last thing they needed was a reckless outsider to make their situation worse. Virus raised an eyebrow. "A human," she muttered, skepticism dripping from her words. "We're saved by a human." Relzek clenched his fists, trying to suppress his frustration. "Get the coordinates to the Stormbreaker and have them ready to dock. I'll need to assess this. Human." His voice was stern, but there was no time for hesitation. As the hours passed, Relzek found himself staring out at the swirling void around them, watching the light from the dying star cast an eerie glow across the ship. They were running out of time, and if this human couldn't get to them quickly, they would all be lost. The crew was depending on him, and the weight of their fate pressed heavily on his shoulders. But then, just as the tension reached its peak, a new signal appeared on the horizon. A flicker of light. The Stormbreaker was coming. And with it, their last hope. Blaise Callahan grinned as he punched the throttle of his ship, the Stormbreaker, slamming it into high-speed mode. The engines roared to life, blasting him forward through the asteroid field surrounding the racing circuit. The Sol Drift was one of the most dangerous star races in the galaxy, and Blaise was in the middle of it, right on the tail of a rival pilot. His hands gripped the controls with expert precision, steering through the narrow gaps between massive asteroids as his heart raced. He loved the thrill of the chase. It wasn't just about winning. It was about the sheer rush of flying at breakneck speeds, dodging death at every turn. He could feel the cold sweat on his brow, but he didn't mind. The adrenaline made him feel alive. But just as he was about to make his move for the final stretch, his comm system buzzed, cutting through the roar of the engines. It was a distress signal, an emergency from deep in space, from a ship in need of immediate help. Blaze glanced at the coordinates. He frowned. This wasn't a normal call. It came from far outside the race's designated zone, from an area known for its collapsed stars and dangerous gravitational anomalies. The signal was faint but persistent. Someone was in trouble. He toggled the comms, shutting off the race chatter. "This is Blaze Callahan, pilot of the Stormbreaker." "Who's out there?" His voice rang out, confident, but with a hint of curiosity. The response was crackling, static-filled, but clear enough to make out. It was a voice unlike any Blaze had ever heard, commanding, authoritative. "This is Commander Ralzek of the Vorthar. We are stranded in the Zara the Nebula, and we require immediate assistance. Our engines are down, and we are being pulled into a collapsing star." Blaze raised an eyebrow. A Vorlon Empire ship. That was unexpected. The Vorlon were known for their powerful military and disciplined crews. They weren't the type to ask for help. But the urgency in Ralzek's voice made it clear they weren't just calling for a rescue. They were desperate. Blaze felt a spark of excitement. This was no ordinary mission. He quickly glanced back at the race. The competitors were still ahead of him, but Blaze wasn't worried. He wasn't about to risk his life for a race trophy. Real danger called, and that was a challenge he couldn't ignore. With one smooth motion, he pulled the Stormbreaker out of the race, executing a sharp loop to divert course toward the distressed ship. The maneuver was daring, even for him, but Blaze had been in far worse scrapes. "Sorry, fellas. This race is over for me," Blaze muttered to himself with a grin, the rush of excitement rising within him as he aimed his ship towards the unknown. As the Stormbreaker roared into hyperspace, Blaze ran over the details in his mind. The Zara the Nebula was notorious for its unstable gravitational fields, capable of tearing apart even the strongest ships. It was a death trap for anyone caught without the right equipment. He'd need to move fast, use every trick in his book. Blaze's mind raced as he calculated the trajectory to reach the Vorthar before it was too late. He didn't know much about the Vorlon, but if they were anything like their reputation, they weren't the type to welcome outsiders. Still, he knew the stakes. If he didn't get there in time, the entire crew of the Vorthar would be lost to the collapsing star. The minutes felt like hours as the Stormbreaker sliced through space, the stars around him a blur of light. The Vorthar would be in his sights soon, and Blaze didn't plan on letting them down. He was Earth's best pilot for a reason, and today he was going to prove it. With a deep breath, he prepared himself for the challenge ahead, a smirk playing on his lips. One thing was certain. If there was a way to save the crew of the Vorthar, Blaze Callahan would find it. Blaze Callahan's ship, the Stormbreaker, hurtled through the vast expanse of space, the bright stars around him barely registering as he focused all his attention on the task at hand. The Vorthar was now in sight, its massive hull limping through the emptiness, a shadow of its former self. Blaze's sharp eyes locked onto the ship, taking in the details: the damaged engines, the flickering lights, the growing proximity to the gravitational pull of the collapsing star. He knew time was running out. He wasted no time. Blaze activated the comms, his voice smooth but firm. "This is Blaze Callahan, coming in hot. Get ready to receive the Stormbreaker." Inside the Vorthar, Commander Ralzek stood at the bridge, his eyes fixed on the viewport. He couldn't believe it. A human pilot was coming to their rescue. As much as the Vorlon Empire prided itself on its self-sufficiency, even they couldn't ignore the reality that they were about to be swallowed by the collapsing star. Virus, the ship's tactical officer, paced back and forth, her thoughts racing. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Commander?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "A Terran? They're reckless. Do we really want to trust a stranger with our lives?" Ralzek clenched his fists, his jaw tight with frustration. He knew the risks. But there was no other choice. The ship's systems were failing, and their position was becoming increasingly perilous. The gravitational forces from the dying star were pulling them in with growing intensity. The Vorthar wouldn't last much longer. "Do we have any other options?" Ralzek snapped, his voice cold but filled with urgency. "We have no time to argue. We either take the risk and accept his help, or we all die here." Virus stopped pacing and looked at him, her expression hardened. She didn't like it, but she knew he was right. There was no alternative. Meanwhile, Blaze's heart raced as he aligned his ship with the Vorthar's damaged hull. His mind was clear, focused entirely on getting this right. There was no room for error. He reached for the comms once more, speaking with a calm confidence. "I'm locking onto your docking bay now. Keep your crew ready. This is going to get bumpy." Blaze guided the Stormbreaker closer, feeling the pulse of the collapsing star just beyond their reach. The Vorthar's magnetic field was pulling them in with incredible force, but Blaze adjusted the Stormbreaker's thrusters, using the agility of his smaller ship to make the docking procedure as smooth as possible. Inside the Vorthar, Ralzek's eyes narrowed. He wasn't convinced yet. This human might be skilled, but it didn't mean he could handle the pressures of a situation like this. The Vorlon were trained for high-stakes operations, each member of the crew conditioned to survive impossible odds. They didn't rely on anyone else to get them out of tight spots. The thought of a human swooping in and saving them, especially one known for his recklessness, made Ralzek's stomach churn. Still, the fact remained. Blaze was their only hope. Ralzek took a deep breath and gave the order. "Prepare for docking. We'll have to work quickly." Blaze's ship finally made contact with the Vorthar, the engines of the Stormbreaker whirling to a halt. He powered down the systems and unbuckled himself from his seat. His boots clicked against the metal floor as he stood, a confident smile on his face despite the tense atmosphere. He knew the Vorlon weren't thrilled to have him on board, but he didn't care. As Blaze entered the Vorthar's bridge, he was met with wary gazes. Ralzek stood tall, his arms crossed, clearly evaluating him with suspicion. Virus stood nearby, her eyes narrowed in distrust. Kotal, the ship's engineer, was busy with diagnostic screens, trying to keep the ship's systems from failing entirely. Blaze wasn't fazed by the cold reception. He walked to the center of the room, his voice steady. "All right, here's the plan. We need to fire up those engines, or we'll be toast in less than an hour. I'm going to need full access to your systems, and a crew that's ready to follow orders." Virus shot him a sharp look. "You think we'll just hand over control to a stranger?" Blaze raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "You don't have much of a choice." He motioned to the view outside the viewport. "The star's collapsing, and unless you're ready to become part of its gravity well, you're going to have to trust me." Ralzek locked eyes with Blaze, still uncertain, but the desperation in his gaze was unmistakable. There was no time to waste. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "You have control. But if you fail, we all die." Blaze smirked. "I'm used to those odds." Blaze Callahan wasted no time. The moment he was granted access to the Vorthar's control systems, he jumped straight into action. His eyes scanned the chaotic mess of flashing red alerts and dying screens. The ship's systems were hanging on by a thread, barely functional. The Vorthar's engines were in ruins, and the crew had no way of escaping the collapsing star's pull. But Blaze didn't hesitate. This was the kind of challenge he thrived on. "What we need right now," Blaze muttered, more to himself than anyone else, "is a burst of speed. We've got to get out of this gravity well before it drags us in." He turned to Kotal, a ship's engineer, who had been working frantically to restore some semblance of order to the ship's power grid. "Kotal, how much power do we have left in the auxiliary engines?" Blaze asked, his tone sharp. Kotal looked up, sweat trickling down his face. "Barely enough to power the life support systems," he said, his voice strained. "If we use it for anything else, we'll lose everything." Blaze's mind raced. He knew this was their only chance. The gravity from the collapsing star was getting stronger by the minute. They had no time to waste. Then we'll use it for one big push. Enough to get us out of this mess. He turned to the controls, his hands flying over the buttons and switches. Kotal, override the power grid and reroute everything we've got into the engines. Trust me, it's the only way. The engineer hesitated for a moment, clearly torn, but Blaze's confidence was undeniable. The stakes were too high. With a grunt of frustration, Kotal complied, inputting the necessary commands. Blaze felt the surge of power flow into the ship's engines. The ship shuddered, groaning under the strain. Ralzek, standing nearby, watched with a mix of skepticism and growing hope. "This is madness," he muttered, but his eyes were fixed on Blaze. "You really think this will work?" Blaze didn't look up. "It's the only shot we've got." Virus, who had been watching the situation unfold with a cool, calculating gaze, finally spoke up. "What exactly is your plan, Blaze Callahan? We can't just push our way out of this. There's no escape from the gravity field without proper thrust." Blaze grinned, his blue eyes flashing with determination. "That's where I come in." He stood from the control panel and began to issue orders. "Virus, get ready to activate the forward shields. We'll need them when we hit the radiation belt. Kotal, I need you to stabilize the energy flow to the rear thrusters. We're going to need every ounce of power for this." Ralzek stepped forward. "You're talking about a maneuver that's never been done before. You're asking us to fly this ship straight through a collapsing star's gravitational pull at full speed." Blaze didn't hesitate. "Exactly." His fingers hovered over the final control button. "We're going to slingshot around that star. We'll use its gravity to give us the speed we need to break free. But we'll need to angle the Vorthar just right, or it'll be the last thing we do." For a moment, there was complete silence. Ralzek and Virus exchanged looks, but both could see the seriousness in Blaze's eyes. They had no better options. "All right, Callahan," Ralzek said after a long pause. Blaze gave a sharp nod. "Just make sure your crew is ready to hold on tight." He took a deep breath and engaged the ship's controls. The Vorthar groaned again, its hull rattling under the stress as Blaze initiated the risky maneuver. The ship lurched forward, hurtling toward the collapsing star at a dangerous speed. Blaze's eyes never left the navigation display. The gravitational field from the star began to distort the view outside, warping the light around them. It was like flying through a storm of cosmic energy, and Blaze loved every second of it. "Now," he shouted. He slammed his hand down on the control panel, sending the Vorthar into a sharp, near-impossible turn. The rear thrusters screamed in protest as they fired, sending the ship careening toward the star's event horizon. Everything happened in an instant. The ship jolted violently, and the crew members were thrown forward. Blaze's stomach dropped, but he held onto the controls with a steely grip. They were riding the edge of destruction. The Vorthar screamed through the space-time rift, a blur of metal and light. The ship's shields flared with heat as they entered the radiation belt. Blaze's voice cut through the chaos. "We're almost there. Hold on." For a heartbeat, the universe seemed to stretch, time slowing to a crawl. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, they shot out the other side, the gravitational pull weakening. Blaze had done it. The Vorthar was free. But as the ship coasted into open space, silent and still, the crew was left in stunned silence. They had made it, and Blaze Callahan, the human pilot, had just pulled off the impossible. The Vorthar drifted silently in the cold void of space, its battered hull still creaking from the strain of the near-impossible maneuver Blaze Callahan had just executed. For a moment, everything felt surreal. The ship was free from the collapsing star's deadly grasp. The threat had passed, yet there was a heavy silence among the crew as they processed the reality of their survival. They had come so close to certain death, and now they owed their lives to the human pilot who had taken them on a wild ride through the stars. Blaze sat back in the pilot's seat, breathing heavily, but with a satisfied grin on his face. His hands were still lightly gripping the controls, his body tense from the adrenaline that had coursed through him during the harrowing maneuver. But he couldn't afford to relax yet. There was still much to be done. The bridge slowly came to life as Ralzek, the commander, stepped forward, his usual stoic demeanor now replaced with a hint of admiration. "Callahan," he said, his voice steady but with a note of respect. "I don't know how you did it. That was impossible." Blaze gave a shrug, his grin never fading. Just another day in the life of Earth's best pilot. He looked over at Kotal, who was already at the engineering station, running diagnostics on the damaged systems. "How's the ship holding up?" Kotal looked up from the console, his expression serious. "The main engines are still offline, and the auxiliary systems are strained to their limit, but we're stable for now. We won't be able to travel far on our own, though." Virus, who had been silent until now, crossed her arms over her chest, eyeing Blaze warily. "You've got us out of one mess, Callahan, but I still don't trust that your reckless flying will be enough to keep us safe." Blaze met her gaze without flinching. "Fair enough. But if you want to get back to your people, you're going to need me." His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. He'd proven himself in the most dangerous of situations, and now he wasn't about to let anyone doubt him. Ralzek turned to Virus, his expression hardening. "Enough, Virus. We don't have time for this. We owe Callahan our lives." He turned back to Blaze. "What do you suggest, pilot?" Blaze didn't hesitate. "First, we need to get the Vorthar into a safe orbit. Then we can start repairs. The nearest space station is a few days away, but we'll need to make sure we can make it there without running into more problems." Virus frowned. "And how exactly do you plan to do that with no working engines?" Blaze's grin widened. "That's where you come in." He gestured toward her. "I'll need you to work with Kotal. We'll need to boost the auxiliary thrusters, use them to at least steer us toward the station. It's risky, but it's our best shot." Kotal nodded, clearly trusting Blaze's judgment. "It's possible. It will take time, but we can manage." Ralzek looked over the crew, his mind working quickly. He had no doubt that Blaze's plan was their best option, but it still worried him. They were stranded far from their home, with limited resources, and now they had to rely on a human they had only just met. Trusting Blaze completely was a leap of faith, but there was no other choice. "Do it," Ralzek ordered. "We don't have much time." As the crew scrambled to make the necessary adjustments, Blaze stood up from his seat and made his way to the observation window. He looked out at the vast emptiness of space, the stars shining brightly in the distance. They were safe for now, but the journey ahead was far from over. He knew they would face more dangers, more obstacles, but something about the crew of the Vorthar was different. They weren't the type to give up. They weren't the type to back down. And neither was he. Blaze had already pulled off the impossible. He had saved them from certain death, but he knew that the true test was just beginning. He would need to keep pushing, keep thinking fast, and keep fighting alongside the crew if they had any hope of getting home. The crew was grateful, yes, but there was something else stirring in the air, a tension, a sense of unease. Blaze couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. The Vorthar might have escaped one death trap, but space was full of unknowns, and Blaze wasn't about to lower his guard. In the distance, a dark storm brewed on the horizon. It was a storm that no one on the Vorthar could see yet, but Blaze could feel it, a new threat that was lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. And when it came, Blaze Callahan would be ready. The Vorthar coasted through the cold vacuum of space, its once majestic form now a battered husk, struggling to maintain its course. Inside, the crew was working tirelessly to keep the ship stable. Blaze Callahan stood in the center of the bridge, his mind focused on the task ahead. He had pulled off the impossible, guiding the ship to safety, but the weight of their situation was far from over. They were far from home, running on limited power, and with a star's gravitational pull barely behind them. A new challenge was approaching. Blaze turned to Ralzek, who was studying a star map on the main console, his brow furrowed in thought. "How far are we from the station?" Blaze asked, his voice low but urgent. Ralzek didn't look up. 3 days, maybe 4, depending on the damage to our thrusters. His tone was tired, but there was still a sense of authority behind it. "We're losing precious time. The longer we wait, the less chance we have of making it without getting into a real fight." Blaze rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He knew Ralzek was right. They couldn't afford to sit around and wait, especially with so many dangers lurking in the unknown. "What kind of threats are we looking at?" Virus, who had been quiet for a while, spoke up from her position at the tactical console. "Pirates, raiders, you name it. This area of space is known for hostile ships that prey on the weak. With the Vorthar in its current state, we're an easy target." She narrowed her eyes. "We've got to keep our shields up and our weapons ready, or we won't make it to the station in one piece." Blaze exhaled sharply, his mind working quickly. The crew of the Vorthar had survived the collapsing star's pull, but the dangers they were about to face on their journey to safety were far from over. He could already feel the tension in the air, thick with the unspoken fear of what might be out there. "We can't risk getting ambushed," Blaze said, his voice steady. "We need to be ready for anything. Virus, keep an eye on the scanners. If anything shows up, I want to know about it first." Virus gave a sharp nod, her fingers flying over the controls as she monitored the sensor data. She didn't like being on the defensive, but with their damaged ship, it was all they could do for now. Blaze turned to Kotal, who was overseeing the ship's remaining systems. "How's the engine power looking?" Blaze asked. Kotal's hands worked across the console, his face grim as he ran diagnostics. "We're barely holding on. The power grid is overloaded, and the auxiliary engines are only running at 50% efficiency. We won't be able to fight a battle in this state. If we get attacked, we'll have to rely on the shields and weapons, if they still work." Blaze didn't flinch. "We're not fighting. Not unless we have no choice." He looked around the room, meeting each crew member's gaze. "We're going to outsmart them. I'm going to make sure we get to that station in one piece." There was a brief silence before Ralzek spoke again, his voice tight with concern. "And if you can't outsmart them?" Blaze met his gaze without hesitation. "Then we'll make our stand, but it won't come to that." Virus' eyes flicked to the scanners, her fingers frozen on the controls. "Wait, I'm picking something up. It's faint, but it's a ship, and it's moving fast." Blaze's heart skipped a beat. They were being followed. "Get a visual," he commanded, moving to the front of the bridge. Virus quickly adjusted the scanner settings, and the view outside the ship flickered as a dark silhouette appeared on the horizon. The ship was coming closer, its design unfamiliar and menacing. "Pirates?" Kotal asked, his voice filled with suspicion. Blaze nodded, his expression hardening. "Could be, but we're not waiting around to find out." He turned back to Ralzek. "We need to move. Now." With quick, precise orders, Blaze directed the crew to maneuver the ship. He knew the Vorthar couldn't outrun the enemy, but if they could stay one step ahead, they might be able to evade the pursuit long enough to reach the station. The crew moved swiftly, preparing for a potential fight. But Blaze wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. The Vorthar may have been damaged, but Blaze had done the impossible once before, and he was willing to do it again. As the mysterious ship closed in, Blaze stared out at the endless expanse of space, his mind focused. Whatever was out there, whatever it was that had been following them, they were about to find out just how far Blaze Callahan would go to protect the crew of the Vorthar. And this time, there would be no escape without a fight. The shadow of the enemy ship grew larger on the scanners, a constant, growing presence that made the air in the Vorthar's bridge thick with tension. Blaze Callahan could feel the adrenaline rushing through his veins. He stood firm at the helm, hands gripping the controls, ready for whatever came next. His mind raced, calculating their next move, But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to let these pirates take the crew down. Not on his watch. Ralzek stood by the comms, watching the enemy ship on the view screen. It was a sleek, predatory vessel, designed for speed and stealth. Just the kind of ship pirates use to catch prey. The silhouette had grown more distinct, and now there was no denying that they were being hunted. "Blaze," Virus said, her voice steady but laced with concern. "They're locking onto us. We can't outrun them, not with our engines in this condition." She turned toward him, her expression serious. "We need to prepare for a fight, or at least try to escape." Blaze didn't look at her as his eyes stayed locked on the controls. "We're not going to fight unless we have no other choice," he said, his tone sharp. "I'm going to outmaneuver them. I've done it before, and I'll do it again." Kotal, who was monitoring the ship's power systems, glanced up. "The auxiliary thrusters can't give us much more speed," he said, his voice strained. "If they're faster than us, they'll catch us. We'll need more power to make any sudden turns." Blaze's mind was already working, calculating the best way to dodge the pirate ship. He turned to Ralzek. "Get ready to engage the shields, but don't use too much power. We can't afford to drain the system." Ralzek gave a tight nod, his hands moving to the console as he prepared to activate the ship's defense systems. The tension in the room was palpable, the crew watching and waiting, knowing that every move they made now could mean the difference between survival and destruction. Virus focused on the enemy ship's movements, watching closely as it began to close the gap. "They're firing," she warned. "They're getting ready to strike. Blaze, we need to act now." Blaze didn't hesitate. With a sharp motion, he spun the controls, sending the Vorthar into a sudden, sharp turn. The ship lurched under the strain, and for a moment, everything seemed to stretch in slow motion. The ship was tumbling through space, using every ounce of the weak thrusters to twist away from the incoming fire. Outside, the pirate ship's weapons flashed with deadly precision, laser blasts cutting through the darkness of space. The Vorthar's shields flared to life just in time, the energy shields absorbing the first wave of fire. The ship shuddered with the impact, but it held firm. Blaze gritted his teeth, knowing that they couldn't take many more hits like that. "We've got to get them off our tail," Blaze muttered under his breath. He slammed his hand on the console, ordering the ship into another wild maneuver. The Vorthar twisted through space, narrowly avoiding the next set of laser blasts. For a brief moment, it felt like they were dancing with death, narrowly escaping the pirate's grip. But the pirate ship was fast, too fast. Blaze could feel it gaining on them, like a predator closing in on its prey. He needed something bold, something that would give them a real chance. His eyes flicked to the sensors, and then he saw it, an asteroid field, just ahead. It was their only hope. "Hold tight," Blaze shouted to the crew, his voice full of determination. "We're going to make a run for the asteroids. If we can lose them in there, we might have a shot." Blaze's heart raced as he dodged the larger asteroids, expertly weaving the Vorthar through the narrow gaps. The ship shook with every impact, but Blaze held steady. The asteroid field was their best chance to escape, but it was also the most dangerous. One wrong move, and they'd be destroyed. The pirate ship followed closely behind, refusing to lose their target. But Blaze wasn't giving up. He swerved the ship again, narrowly missing an enormous asteroid. The Vorthar shuddered as the shields absorbed another blast, but they were still alive. He glanced back over his shoulder, watching the pirate ship struggle to keep up with the shifting terrain of the asteroid field. They were slower, more vulnerable in the chaos. Blaze grinned. He could do this. With one last daring move, he pushed the Vorthar into a sharp turn, sending them deep into the heart of the asteroid belt. The pirate ship, unable to make the same maneuver, was forced to slow down, its path blocked by a massive asteroid. Blaze exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They had done it. The pirate ship had been left behind. For now, at least. But Blaze knew they couldn't stop here. They were still deep in enemy territory, and the next threat could be just around the corner. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The Vorthar floated through the asteroid field, its battered hull groaning as it navigated the debris. Blaise Callahan's hands remained firm on the controls, his focus unwavering. Every time he piloted the ship through another tight squeeze between two massive asteroids, the adrenaline hit him again. The crew was alive, for now, but the battle wasn't over. They had escaped the pirate ship, but Blaise knew that danger had a way of finding them, even in the quietest corners of space. The asteroid field was a temporary hiding place, but it was not a long-term solution. The ship's damaged engines and frail shields wouldn't last forever, and the pirate ship might be lurking just outside, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Vorthar was weak, and so was its crew. Still, Blaise wasn't ready to give in. He was a pilot, and pilots always found a way to survive. Ralzek approached Blaise, his steps deliberate. His usual calm demeanor had a hint of tension now, the reality of their situation settling in. "We've avoided the pirates for now, but I'm not sure how much longer we can hide," he said, his voice low but firm. "We need a plan, Blaise. We need to know what comes next." Blaise nodded, his eyes scanning the sensors. The field was dense with asteroids, but the longer they stayed, the more likely they were to be discovered. "I know," Blaise replied, "but we need to buy some time, and we need to fix what we can." Kotal appeared next to Ralzek, his face tired but determined. "We've patched up as much as we could, but we're still far from being battle-ready. The thrusters are only operating at 40% efficiency. Without full power, the shields can't sustain a prolonged fight. We need a miracle to make it through the next attack." Blaise's mind raced. He was no engineer, but he knew enough to understand the severity of the situation. He had seen damaged ships limp along on minimal power before, but none of them had made it far. Not when there were pirates hunting them, not when the odds were stacked so high against them. The Vorthar wasn't just broken, it was a sitting duck in the middle of enemy space. Virus walked up to them, her eyes scanning the sky outside. "I've been watching the scans," she said quietly. "There's no sign of the pirates, but they're not going to leave us alone forever. We need to get out of here and head toward the station, or we're just waiting for the next attack." Blaise exhaled sharply, trying to clear his head. Virus was right. Staying here would only prolong the inevitable. They needed to find a way out, even if it was a long shot. He stared at the asteroid field again, his mind running over their options. There was one possibility, one idea that might just work, but it was risky. "We need to get to that space station," Blaise said, his voice steady, though his mind was still working out the details. "It's the closest safe haven, and it's our only chance of getting fully repaired. The station is about 2 days away from here. If we can get enough power to the engines, we can make it." Ralzek looked skeptical, but his eyes softened with trust. "How can we possibly make it there in our state?" Blaise gave him a grim smile. "We're going to have to take a gamble." We pushed the ship to its limit, using the asteroid field as cover. We'll keep moving fast, keep our trajectory unpredictable. If the pirates are still out there, they won't be able to track us if we stay on the move. But it all depends on our power. If the thrusters fail before we reach the station. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what it meant. "We'll do what we can," Kotal said, his voice resigned but determined. "We'll reroute power from non-essential systems to the engines. It won't be much, but it's something." Virus gave Blaise a hard look. "This better work. If we run out of options, we'll have to fight. And I don't want to be stuck in a battle we can't win." Blaise nodded. He knew the stakes. "We won't have to fight if we're careful." He turned back to the control panel, his hands hovering over the switches. "Get ready. We're going to make a run for it." As the crew scrambled to reroute the ship's remaining power, Blaise's mind was sharp, focused. The Vorthar was all but dead in the water. It could be their last chance at survival, or it could be their final ride. But Blaze wasn't the type to quit, not when there was still a sliver of hope. "Hold on tight," Blaze said, a determined smile spreading across his face. "We're going to outrun this storm." With that, the Vorthar roared to life once more, its engines straining under the pressure as Blaze steered it toward the open space ahead. They had a long road ahead, but for now, there was one thing Blaze knew for sure. He would do everything in his power to get them through it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The Vorthar cut through space like a wounded beast, its once proud hull battered but still holding together. Blaze Callahan kept his hand steady on the controls, steering them through the empty void as they made their final push toward the distant space station. The ship groaned with every turn, every slight jolt, as if it too was fighting for survival. But so was Blaze, and so was every member of the crew. The pirate threat might still be out there, but they were focused on one goal: reaching the station and finding safety. The engines roared in protest, pushing the Vorthar harder than it had been pushed before. Kotal had worked tirelessly to reroute power, draining every last drop from non-essential systems, just to keep the ship moving. There were moments when it felt like the ship might fall apart under the strain, but Blaze kept his focus. He wouldn't let them down. Not now. Ralzek's voice came through the comms, sharp and urgent. "Blaze, we've got a problem. We're nearing the last stretch of the asteroid field, but our fuel reserves are running dangerously low. If we don't make it to the station soon, we won't have enough power to maintain speed." Blaze's heart raced. They were so close, so painfully close, but the odds were stacked against them. The Vorthar could run on fumes for only so long. He glanced at the sensors. Nothing but the dark void ahead. No signs of the pirate ship yet, but it wouldn't be long before the enemy realized they had escaped into this part of space. And when they did, the Vorthar wouldn't be able to outrun them for much longer. "Hold on," Blaze muttered to himself, gripping the controls tighter. He punched in a series of commands, pushing the ship's remaining power to its limits. "We're almost there. We just have to make it." Virus stood beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. "Any sign of the pirates?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an edge of concern. Blaze shook his head. "Not yet, but they're still out there. We just have to make sure we get to the station first." The seconds felt like hours as the ship jolted forward, every inch of its worn systems straining. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Blaze saw something. 2 faint blips on the scanner, small but unmistakable. The pirates had found them. "They're here," Blaze said, his voice flat with resolve. "Brace yourselves. We're going to have to outrun them." Virus immediately moved to the tactical console, her fingers flying over the controls as she prepared the shields for an incoming attack. "They're closing in fast," she reported. "We won't be able to dodge much longer." Blaze's mind was a blur of calculations as he glanced at the station's coordinates on the screen. It was close, too close. The Vorthar could make it, but only if they gave everything they had. Blaze slammed his hand on the console, directing the ship into a sharp, desperate turn. The pirate ships were faster, more agile, and their weapons were already locked onto the Vorthar. They'd be ready to fire any moment. "We're not losing them now," Blaze growled, his jaw set with determination. He shoved the throttle forward, sending the ship hurtling toward the station. "Almost there," Kotal muttered, his eyes glued to the energy readings. The ship's power levels were dangerously low, and the auxiliary thrusters were barely holding on. If they didn't make it soon, the Vorthar would stop functioning completely. The sound of lasers fired from the pirate ships echoed through the ship's hull as Blaze veered through space, narrowly avoiding a blast that would have torn the ship apart. The shields flickered dangerously. "We can't keep this up," Virus shouted. "They're going to break through." Blaze didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the distant space station, now just a few minutes away. They had to make it. There was no other choice. With a final surge, the Vorthar leaped forward, its engines screaming in protest. And then, just as Blaze thought they might not make it, a burst of laser fire from the pirate ships collided with the Vorthar's shields. The ship jolted violently, throwing Blaze and the crew into the safety restraints. For a moment, everything went black. When Blaze opened his eyes, the station's docking bay was right in front of them. They had made it. The Vorthar had made it. "We're inside," Ralzek said, his voice a mix of disbelief and relief. We actually made it." Blaze leaned back in his chair, breathless but triumphant. They had done it. They had survived. For now. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. The crew exchanged looks of exhaustion, relief, and gratitude. They had faced impossible odds and come out alive. And as Blaze Callahan stared at the docking bay ahead, he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.